brothers and sisters, in the midst of the 21st chapter of the Apocalypse, considering the holy city, the New Jerusalem, which John has described for him in the 21st chapter. Now tonight could be quite interesting. You'll probably need to put your thinking caps on this evening, because I don't believe that things are revealed in a very crystal clear way. There are obviously certain implications which we're going to discuss, but perhaps in some of the things that we shall consider this night, there is no apparent answer or solution to the problems which will be set before us. Now, let's just get the setting of what we're considering. In verse 2 of chapter 21, John sees the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And when we come to verse 9 of this same chapter, there came unto me one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials full of the 7 last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife. And he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain, and he showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. So John is going to describe to us, as was described to him, the framework of this city, the holy Jerusalem. Now, as we saw at the end of the last class, Ezekiel was to see a very similar type of vision. Ezekiel was also taken to a high mountain, and he had described for him a temple city. Now, the thing which we've got to bear in mind all the way through these verses in chapter 21 is that Ezekiel was dealing with a natural one, something which is yet to be built upon the mountains of Israel, the house of prayer for all nations. It's something which will be tangible, something which will be real, something which will be a temple city, as Solomon's was the temple, as the tabernacle was the dwelling place of God in the wilderness. It is something which will be erected, built upon the mountains of Israel. First, that which is natural, and based upon certain similarities of the natural, John has described for him a spiritual temple. Now, the things which are described, obviously, are described as if it was a literal building. But we shall see as we go through the verses that it is not a literal building, nor could be. But we've also been told in verse 9 and 10 that it is describing the bride, the Lamb's wife. So what we have described in the 21st chapter is representing the bride of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now again, as we saw last time, that bride has been in the stages of development since the days of Adam. There will be a first aspect of that glorified bride seen when the saints are revealed at the first resurrection as being those who have been accounted worthy to be invited into the kingdom and to be granted immortality. And it will be that bride, the saints, who will be the rulers with the Lord Jesus Christ of that kingdom age. That bride will not be complete until at the end of the millennium, until the end of the little season, when in the second resurrection those who have lived during the kingdom, who have now been accounted worthy, will then together, after being given immortality, be joined with the bride who have reigned during the kingdom, to the total elect as being made up. And John is having described to him the constituent part of that glorious community. Now we are going to see how beautifully they are to represent us, God willing, according to his mercy, as we hope to stand with the Master in that kingdom age. But the final description cannot be seen until the end of the little season, when all things will be perfect. Now, we've got to bear in mind, and I'll stress it again, But as we're going through the verses in chapter 21, it will appear that we are looking at a natural building, but we are not. We're looking, as the apocalypse is revealed right from chapter 1, in sign and symbol, that which is representing the bride of Christ. Now, to set the scene, can we go back to the second book of the Corinthians and chapter 6? The second letter to the Corinthians and chapter 6, and we know the words well. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 16, what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now none of us misunderstand verse 16. The bride of Christ, the saint community, is described as the temple of the living God. And Paul uses the terminology as if, like with a literal temple, you can walk in it and dwell in it. But of course we know that he is speaking in a spiritual sense, because it is brethren and sisters, men and women, which comprise the spiritual temple of which God says, I will dwell in them and walk in them. Now, it's the same idea in Ephesians chapter 2. And what John has described for him in that 21st chapter of the Apocalypse is exactly what the Apostle Paul had in mind when writing to Corinth and writing to Ephesus. And in Ephesians chapter 2, and in verse 19, Now therefore you are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth into an holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit. And that is what John is having described for him in the 21st chapter. It's this building fitly framed together which groweth up into a holy temple in the Lord. Now, in a different symbol, the same idea is described by the apostle in chapter 4 of this same letter. He speaks in verse 13 of that perfect man, the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. It's that same multitudinous Christ man that we saw in the first chapter of the Apocalypse. And in verse 15 he says, speaking the truth in love, may grow up into him in all things which is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. And using the symbol of the body, the apostle is using the brethren and sisters combining together, joining together, fitly joined together, will grow up into this perfect, multitudinous Christ body. Now that's the same idea as the temple, the dwelling place of God. It comprises of brethren and sisters. Although it is using words which seem to describe or have the aspect of a literal temple, it's not. We're dealing with signs and symbols describing the spiritual. Now, on our way back to the Apocalypse, can we drop into Hebrews chapter 12? The apostle here is contrasting the things of the Mosaic to that of the Abrahamic as far as the covenants were concerned. And in verse 21 of Hebrews chapter 12, concerning the old, he says, so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. Then he goes on, but ye are come unto the Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly, an ecclesia of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect. And we all appreciate, without going through the phrases, exactly what the Apostle Paul means, that we are called unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Now if you come back to chapter 21 of the Apocalypse, it's this heavenly Jerusalem which John saw in verse 2, the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as the bride adorned for her husband. So what we're going to see, brothers and sisters, in the constituent parts of this spiritual temple, the things which characterize and represent the saint community. So we find, as John has this vision unfurled for him, in verse 12, we find that there was a wall, and there was a wall great and high, and there was 12 gates, and at the gates were 12 angels, and names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. And then on the east there were 3 gates, on the north there were 3 gates, on the south there were 3 gates, and on the west there were 3 gates. And therefore verse 16 becomes obvious. The city lieth foursquare. It was a square with 3 gates on each side. And we find in verse 14, and the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So John has described a wall round about a city, and the city lieth foursquare, and each of the walls round about the city had 3 gates on each side. And he was told to measure this city. And you'll notice what he says. Verse 16, and the length is as large as the breadth, and he measured the city with the reed 12,000 furlongs. The length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. 12,000 by 12,000 by 12,000. Now because we've got Nicholas here tonight, he'll be able to convert 12,000 furlongs into miles. And of course spontaneously he will tell us that it's 1,500 miles, with 8 furlongs to the mile. And therefore with a literal city, you've got a city literally 1,500 miles long, broad and high. Now obviously the atmosphere of the earth wouldn't stretch anywhere near that sort of distance. 1,500 miles high. And if you think of it being built in, for example, the land of Israel, you would cover obviously the length and the breadth and more of the land of Israel. But John is not having described for him a literal city, is having described a spiritual city. And therefore we need to unravel why John is given 12,000 furlongs as a measurement. He also measured separately the wall, and the wall is expressed in a different measure, not furlongs, but 144 cubits. And again, scripturally, the cubit is the length between the end of your finger and your elbow. That is a cubit, the forearm and the hand, which was the measure of a cubit. And that approximately is about 18 inches. I know it's going to vary depending on the length of your arm, but on average it was representing around 18 inches. Now if this wall was surrounding the city, and the city was 1,500 miles long and broad, and yet the wall round it was only 144 times 18 inches. Obviously, from a geometrical point of view, it's nonsense. And that is the reason I believe the Spirit is giving us those measurements, because from a natural point of view, it is nonsense. And the bride community, from a natural point of view, is nonsense, because they can't understand it. People of the flesh cannot understand and appreciate the bride of Christ. And the description of this temple cannot be understood from a natural point of view. It's got to be considered from a spiritual. And that's where we shall need to put our thinking caps on, as to what the meaning of it is from a spiritual point of view. Because I don't believe, brothers and sisters, there is so many specific answers as perhaps there are with others. And again, before we go into the details, maybe the reason that the specific details are not given is going back to Ephesians and chapter 3. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 14. For this cause I bow my knees unto the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, of whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might by his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God. And although I've heard many brethren wrestle with verse 18, I still personally believe that the reason that we cannot make common sense of verse 18, because you've got a depth and the height, is that it is what Paul says in verse 19, beyond knowledge, to appreciate the love of God, that we might be fulfilled with all his fullness. And I believe, brothers and sisters, as we cannot fully understand and appreciate the fullness of the love of Christ, so that we cannot, with our finite minds, fully understand and appreciate the depths of what is being described for us in the 21st chapter of the Apocalypse. We're obviously are going to make suggestions, as you would expect me to do, but I do not believe by any means we've got the answers fully. I am not totally satisfied in my own mind by any means, and perhaps, and I just use that word advisedly, that the reason for it is that in our mortal finite state we cannot fully appreciate this glorious community which will stand erect at the end of the day. Right, let's come back to chapter 21 and let's see what we can start doing with it. Right, so first of all, in verse 12 there was a wall which was great and high. Now the wall is distinct from the city. The wall has a different measurement and is spoken of separately to the city. And therefore we must appreciate there is a distinction between the wall and that which is within. Now what is the purpose of the wall? Well, I suppose again, if we were to think of it naturally, we can all appreciate what the purpose of a wall is. But let Ezekiel answer that question for us, because he describes the wall to the house of prayer for all nations from chapter 40 through to chapter 48. And many times as we go through the 21st chapter we should be referring back to Ezekiel, because most of what John sees is based upon the literal temple, although he is describing a spiritual one. And therefore in verse 5 of Ezekiel chapter 40, Ezekiel says, "And behold, a wall on the outside of the house round about, and in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubit long by a cubit and a hand breadth. So he measured the breadth of the building 1 reed and the height 1 reed. So there was a wall on the outside of the house round about. Now, thankfully, Ezekiel in the 42nd chapter tells us the purpose of this wall. And in verse 20 of Ezekiel 42, he measured the wall by the 4 sides. It had a wall round about, 500 reeds long, 500 broad, and this is the purpose, to make a separation between the sanctuary and the profane place. The wall was to separate that which is holy from that which is profane, to enclose within the wall that which is holy, to keep out of it that which is profane. Now again, I suppose from a natural point of view, and I'm no builder, perhaps Charles could help us here, if one was building a wall to protect something, you would build it great and high so that we would protect that which was in to keep away or out that which was from the outside. And that's exactly what the wall is. It's to separate that which is holy from that which is profane. Now verse 12 of the Apocalypse 21 says that it was a wall great and high. It was a wall great and high. And it was to separate that which is holy from that which is profane. Now, if we can come back to Zechariah chapter 2, I was tempted to go through Zechariah 2, but I thought it might be confusing, so I won't. Because Zechariah was also told to measure Jerusalem in verse 2, to see what is the breadth, the length, etc. But we don't want to digress. The point I want to come to is in verse 5 of Zechariah 2. For I, saith Yahweh, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. Yahweh describes himself as a wall of fire round about, and he would be the glory in the midst of her. And therefore Zechariah is saying quite clearly that it is the Spirit of the Almighty, the Yahweh Spirit, as Brother Thomas describes it, which is separating that which is holy from that which is profane. And the angels of God encompass round about those that fear him. And it's the Almighty, as it were, who is causing that wall of protection to keep out that which is profane, to protect that which is holy. Now again, I believe the 21st chapter of the Apocalypse endorses this. If we come back into chapter 21, verse 18, the building of the wall was of jasper. The building of the wall was of jasper. And if you go back to verse 11, when it describes this holy Jerusalem, it says, it was having the glory of God, verse 11, and her light was like unto a stone most precious, even a jasper stone, clear as crystal. Therefore the glory of God is described like a jasper stone, clear as crystal. And that was the view which one would have as the holy city descended from heaven, because it was surrounded by the wall. And therefore the impression that you would get would be as of a jasper stone, which was representing the glory of God. And that's what Zechariah 2 verse 5 was saying in a literal sense. describing the people, when I meant literal, of Judah as it will be in the future. Apocalypse 21 is showing to us that the wall is representing the things of God, which is caused to separate the holy from the profane. And he is the wall which is surrounding us to protect us, as it will, obviously, through his Spirit, be that which is reflecting the glory of God. Now I believe is the first point which John wants us to appreciate, that there is a distinction between that which is holy and that which is profane. Now, as a further dimension, can we go back to the Song of Solomon? And I believe that in the Song of Solomon, in a glorious picture of the bride and the bridegroom, as it will be in the future with Christ and his bride, the bride describes herself in verse 10 of Songs chapter 8. Songs chapter 8 and verse 10. She says, I am a wall, and my breasts are like towers. Then was I in his eyes as one that found favour. In what sense, brothers and sisters, does the bride describe herself as a wall? I will suggest the answer is in chapter 4. Songs chapter 4 and in verse 12. A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse. A spring shut up, a fountain sealed. She is a garden enclosed. She is undefiled. And I believe the phraseology is speaking of the virginity of the bride. She is a virgin, as the Apostle Paul described when speaking to Corinth, that she was a chaste virgin unto Christ. And therefore she says, I am a wall. I am being protected to that which is holy from that which is profane. And I believe if we went into the Song of Solomon, and do it at your own leisure, that the idea of the wall and the idea of the garden enclosed is a symbol of the virginity, the pureness, the separateness of the bride community from that which is profane, from that which is outside. And again, when we think about it in the 21st chapter of the Apocalypse, we are separated today through the word of truth. It is God's word which causes us to be separate from that which is outside. And yet, unless we take hold of that word and make that word part of us so that we ourselves want to become separate, the word will have no effect upon us. And therefore, although in its initial aspect it is without question the Yahweh Spirit, God himself, who is protecting the saint community from that which is outside, the saint community itself needs to identify itself with that Spirit in order that she may retain her virginity and become that which is enclosed. And that which is enclosed, described as the songs as a garden, is described by the apocalyptic writer as a city. But it's the same principle. It's protected from that which is without. Right, let's come back to the 21st chapter. And we find in verse 12 that having described the wall, great and high, it had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and the names written thereof, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Now, if we can come back to Ezekiel chapter 44, you will again see a counterpart from a natural point of view in the 44th chapter of Ezekiel. Ezekiel 44, and in verse 23, we'd better go back to pick up the context. It's speaking about the priests, the Levites, in verse 15, the sons of Zadok, that kept the charge of my sanctuary. And it's speaking about the priests, which I believe will be the immortalized priests in the age to come, who will be ministering at the literal temple that is to be erected. I believe in this chapter we've got the distinction between that which will be Levitical, mortal priests, and that which will be immortal, which are described as the sons of Zadok. Now, Brother Charles has made a long study in Ezekiel's temple, so I'm sure he'll only be too pleased to discuss these things with you afterwards. But just for brevity, the sons of Zadok from verse 15 onwards are the ones in verse 16 that enter into his sanctuary. They shall come near to my table to minister unto me, and they shall keep my charge. And he goes on to describe the work of these immortalized priests as they shall administer the affairs of the temple in the age to come. And in verse 23, they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and profane, and cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. And in controversy they shall stand in judgment, and they shall judge it according to my judgment, and they shall keep my laws and my statutes in all mine assembly, and they shall hallow my Sabbaths. So you've got these representative people who will educate the people of that day as they come up to year to worship in defined things. And they are described later on in the prophecy of Ezekiel as the porters, who administer to the affairs of the temple, to show people round, to explain to them what's got to happen, and to educate them in the laws of God. Now, if we come back, we ought to go on a bit. We ought to go on to Ezekiel 44 while we're just there. In Ezekiel 44, now we looked at that, didn't we? Sorry, come back to Apocalypse 21. We find that in verse 12 that we've got at the gates these 12 angels. And I believe what John is causing us to appreciate, that as it was with the literal, so now there is the spiritual, who will administer and help those who will be part of the temple community of the age to come. So what are they representing? What are these 12 angels representing? Well, I believe, as we have seen before, brothers and sisters, for example, in chapter 20 and verse 1, and we could go back to chapter 18 and verse 1, and we could go back to chapter 17 and verse 1, and many other occasions throughout the Apocalypse. The angels are representative of the community of the faithful ones. They are representative of the saint community. Now, as the visions of the Apocalypse unfold to John, he is invited by these representative beings to see the glory that is portrayed. Now, what I believe we've got in verse 12 of the 21st chapter are those of the saint community who have helped to guide and to encourage and to administer the laws of those who will be invited into this temple city. Now, again, just think of it first literally, and we might appreciate the spiritual point. If we went up to the temple which will be built upon the mountains of Israel, there will be those immortalized priests who will help us to understand the significance of the temple. I'm now thinking of us as if we were mortal. They would be able to explain to us divine laws, the commands of God. They would be able to show us the meaning of sacrifice and all the other aspects which will comprise complete and proper divine worship. Now that will be the task of the immortalized priests in the age to come as they guide the people in worship to the Almighty, as they make them a people ready and prepared to be accepted at the end of the millennium into that glorious community. Now, if we now take the thought forward to the spiritual temple, each one of us in our own way have been helped and guided along the way to the kingdom, that we might appreciate the more divine worship, that we may be helped to understand the true meaning of sacrifice, that we may appreciate what is required of each one of us, that we may be part of that glorious community. Now we've got all the great characters of the scriptures who have helped us along. We've got the prophets, we've got the apostles, and perhaps in these latter days we've had very prominent brethren and sisters, and even amongst our own ecclesia and amongst perhaps our own family, those who help us on our way towards the kingdom, who help us to get a better appreciation of what is required. And they're, as it were, porters, they're, as it were, guides, to help us to appreciate what is required of us. Now, as it was seen literally, I believe John is having it described spiritually. We've got these representative angels of the saint community, not literal angels, those who are representing the saint community, made like unto the angels, who are situated at each gate to, as it were, invite us into the city, that we may be given a guided tour, that we may appreciate what it needs, the constituent parts, to be members of this community. And that is, brothers and sisters, what I believe is being described for us in verse 12. Think about it, and first that which is natural, and then bring it to the spiritual. But you'll notice on the gates were names written, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. The names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Now, one thing I'm absolutely confident about, that it is not the names of natural Israel in the sense of having part or lot with the Jews. We have seen right the way through the apocalyptic study that the book is given to the servants of God and has got nothing to do with natural Israel. Now, obviously, part of the community of the redeemed will be Jews. But we are making the distinction between Jews according to the flesh and Jews who are according to the Spirit. So you've got the father of the Jews, Abraham. Now, obviously, Abraham will be part of this glorious community being described here. But we consider Abraham not from a fleshly point of view, but from a spiritual. So we think of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and all the glorious number of the redeemed who were of Jewish stock, but of course rose above their fleshly descent to become spiritual in the sight of God. Now we are making the distinction between them, as well as the Gentiles like us who are part of the glorious community, and natural Jewry, those in the world today in unbelief who will form part of the mortal population over which the 12 apostles will reign. And therefore verse 12 has nothing to do with natural Jewry. So what are the names which are written? Again, let's go back in our Bibles. Numbers chapter 2. In Numbers chapter 2, we're given a plan of the four square encampment of the children of Israel. And we are told, for example, in verse 3, Numbers chapter 2, that on the east side of the camp, toward the rising of the sun, there would be 3 tribes. And we've got Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And then, as we come over to verse 10, we find on the south side there was Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. Then in verse 18, on the west side there should be Ephraim, Manasseh and Benjamin. And then in verse 25, on the north side would be Dan, Asher, Naphtali. Now the point we're saying is that we are given the three tribes on each side of the four-square encampment. We know which tribes were upon which side. Now we come to the 48th chapter of Ezekiel. And chapter 47 and chapter 48 of Ezekiel give us the way that natural Israel will be settled in the land when the Lord Jesus Christ returns and the work of Elijah has been performed. And Ezekiel chapter 47 and 48 gives us a division of the land as natural Israel will be settled according to their former tribes. And we find in the 48th chapter of Ezekiel giving us all the details of these tribes from Dan in the north to Gad in the south. We also find, as we come to verse 30 of Ezekiel 48, and these are the goings out of the city on the north side, 4,500 measures. And the gates of the city shall be after the names of the tribes of Israel. Notice, we're now speaking about the temple which is in the midst of the land. The gates of the city shall be after the names of the tribes of Israel. And again you will notice, 3 gates northward, Reuben, Judah, Levi. 3 gates eastward, verse 32, Joseph, Benjamin, and Dan. 3 gates southward, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun. 3 gates westward, Gad, Asher, Naphtali. We are given again the names of the tribes on each of the 4 sides. Now when we come to the Apocalypse, we are not told who the tribes are on each of the 4 sides. We are told there's 12 gates. We're told that on each side there is 3 gates, exactly the same principle as before, because the city lieth 4 square. But we are not told what names are upon what gates. Now again, as a suggestion, coming back to chapter 7 of the Apocalypse, we are given the number of the redeemed in verse 4. Apocalypse 7 and verse 4. And I heard the number of them which were sealed, and they were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. Now again, these are not natural Israel. And the reason we know they're not natural Israel is because of the 14th chapter of the Apocalypse. Because describing this community representative by that number of 144,000, we find in verse 1 of chapter 14 that first of all they stand with the Lamb upon the Mount Zion. They have the Father's name written in their foreheads. We notice from the end of verse 3 that they were redeemed from the earth. We notice from verse 4, they were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. And the 14th chapter is giving us part of the details of this glorious community of the redeemed, the bride of Christ, represented by 144,000. So coming back to chapter 7 and verse 4, the 12 tribes which are listed from verse 5 to verse 8 are speaking, as we saw when we did the study in chapter 7, of spiritual Israel. And therefore the 12 tribes, based on the natural, are speaking of spiritual Israel. Now we saw in chapter 7 the distinction between the list of names given here and what we have got elsewhere in the scriptures. And we know that some names are added and some are taken away, because it is speaking of the spiritual Israel and not the natural. And therefore I would suggest, brothers and sisters, that the 12 names of the tribes which are upon this city wall in chapter 21 and in verse 12 are the 12 tribes listed in chapter 7. I think there is good reasons to accept that. What we are not given is which tribes are upon which gates. We're not even given what 3 tribes are linked together. And we are not given any more details concerning these tribes. So the question is, why? When the encampment of Israel was given, we are given the exact precise details of which tribe was on which side. Speaking of that city which will be erected in the age to come, we find again in Ezekiel chapter 48 we are given the names which are on each gate on each side. But in the Revelation in chapter 21 and in verse 13 we are given the fact that there were 3 gates. We are not given what names were upon what gates. I'm going to leave you that to ponder. I'm going to come up with a suggestion a bit later on. But I believe there must be a certain reason why the names are not given. We are presuming, but I think it is a fair assumption, that the names are the ones of chapter 7. Why are we not given more detail? Leave that in the abeyance of your minds for the time being. Can we just move on to verse 13? Sorry, verse 14. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The wall of the city had 12 foundations. Now again, if we come back to that 2nd chapter of Ephesians, you will notice that the community of the redeemed has been built upon the foundations of the prophets and the apostles. We saw that when we looked at Ephesians chapter 2 and in verse 20. We are built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. And of course it's the word, the truth as we express it, which has been built upon the foundation of the prophets and the apostles. It's the word which was God and which came from God, John chapter 1. It was the Yahweh Spirit word which has been built upon the foundation of the prophets and the apostles, which has now caused us, in verse 21, to be built into that holy temple in the Lord. And therefore, the wall of the city in verse 14 of chapter 21 had 12 foundations. And we are told that the foundations are the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now that in itself would seem to coincide with Ephesians chapter 2. But there again, there is a dilemma. You would expect the city to be built upon the foundations, not the wall. But if we accept the wall with that which separates the holy from the profane, and if the wall is that which has been built upon the foundation of the truth as established by the prophets and the apostles, one can appreciate that it's the truth which has divided the one from the other. Now if that is so, we find in verse 14 that upon these foundations were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now again, let's go back to Matthew chapter 19. Now I can honestly say, brothers and sisters, we're not setting out to confuse. We're trying to establish the principles which are being spoken of in the 21st chapter. But I did say right at the outset we might have to put our thinking caps on. Now in Matthew chapter 19, you remember the time when the Apostle Peter in verse 27 says to the Master, "Behold, we have forsaken all and followed thee. What shall we have therefore?" And Jesus said unto them, "Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, ye also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So the apostles are singled out from the saint community as having the responsibility of judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So one would get the picture from Ezekiel 47 and 48 that when the tribes are established in the land, from Dan to Gad, from the north to the south, that in each canton, as they are described in Ezekiel's prophecy, in each section, in each tribe, there will be one of the apostles who will judge each of those tribes of the children of Israel. Now that seems to be the promise which the Master gives to these 12 apostles. Now there is no question in my mind that the 12th apostle, who will take over from Judas Iscariot, is Matthias. He was numbered, according to the Acts of the Apostles, with the 12. And therefore I do not believe at all that it will be the Apostle Paul, as some would have us believe. It is Matthias who made up the number of the apostles, because the 12 apostles will be responsible to Israel, where the Apostle Paul is spoken of so many times as the apostle of the Gentiles, not of the Jews. And therefore I believe quite clearly from the Acts of the Apostles that it was Matthias who makes up the number of the 12. But that's by an aside. The point is, the apostles are singled out as having this authority and this sort of job to do in the age to come. Now, coming back to the Apocalypse, chapter 21 and verse 14, the 12 apostles are now named. And they are named in the context of being the foundations. And you also notice in verse 19 that the foundations of the wall of the city were garnished with all manner of precious stones. The foundations had the names of the apostles upon them. But upon these foundations were garnished all manner of precious stones. And therefore I believe what the Revelator is trying to get us to appreciate, that in addition to the apostles were garnished these stones which are representative of something else. Now, the thinking, brothers and sisters, which I have on this is that the wall is showing us what has caused us to be part of that community by separating us from that which is outside. And I believe from our personal point of view, it's been the apostles who, having taken up the challenge of the Lord Jesus Christ, has caused the truth to be established in the eyes of the Gentiles. Because it was the Apostle Peter who was given the privilege of unlocking the keys to the kingdom of heaven, to the Jew first, and then to the Gentile. And it was the Apostle Peter, upon this rock, the statement that he made, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," who started the work of the truth as far as both the Jews and the Gentiles were concerned in their understanding and acceptance of the Lord Jesus Christ. And therefore it is appropriate that they are the foundations upon which the wall of the city, that which is separated, the truth, has been established. And therefore, according to Paul in Ephesians chapter 2 and in verse 20, we have been built upon the foundations of the apostles. And therefore it is appropriate that the truth has been established correctly by them. And therefore in verse 14, of chapter 21. That is the reason I would suggest to you we have the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. We have been built upon the truth which they have established, and that truth, that divine truth, has caused it to be separate from that which is outside. Now, if that being so, brothers and sisters, we find in verse 15 that he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city and the gates thereof and the wall thereof. He had a reed to measure the city. Now again, the city is measured in verse 16. The wall is measured in verse 17. The gates are spoken of in verse 21, but no measurement. But he was told to measure the city and the gates and the wall. And we're given a measurement of the city, we're given a measurement of the wall, we're not given a measurement of the gates. And again, we'll keep that in abeyance, we shall come back to it, as to why there was no measurement. But it is appropriate that a reed was used to measure. If we come back to Ezekiel in chapter 40, we find in the 40th chapter that Ezekiel was also given a reed to measure the literal city. How much time we got, John? Not much. Right. Verse 3, Ezekiel 40 verse 3, and he brought me thither, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of brass, with a line of flax in his hand and a measuring reed, and he stood in the gate. And he uses this reed time and time again to measure the city. And again, in the 21st chapter and in verse 15, a reed was used to measure. But this time it was a golden reed, that which speaks of faith. And we're going to take up the point next time, God willing, as to the measurements of this reed, both in respect of the city and the wall, and perhaps to discuss with you why not the gates, and then to go on to describe what the different terms of measurements were, and again the reasons for it, and again then come back to the other point which we've left in the abeyance of your mind to discuss. And perhaps after next week we'll get the thoughts together, may not next week, the week after, may not concluded, but then perhaps the time after that we shall get the whole picture of this glorious revelation to John.